For the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about how Easter was this turn, or like I've been calling it the turn. The moment when the world went from going one direction, which was a direction towards sin and death and darkness and chaos, to a world that started to head towards harmony, hope, peace, and ultimately what the Jewish people called shalom, or this hope of harmony where the world and everything works as it was intended. And that turn happened because of the resurrection. Now this week I was thinking about how we can think about this again. I've been talking about running a couple miles and then you turn around and come back. But I think another good way to think about the turn, and I did not bring one, would be like a yo-yo. Now I have some yo-yos at home. I am not a good yo-yoer, but when people see what I do with a yo-yo, they're surprised. But then whenever you see the people who are really good, you know that I'm just like an amateur. But I didn't bring a yo-yo because it wouldn't actually work what I'm trying to say. But the normal, like the really simple yo-yos that you would have played with as a kid, you throw it down, right? Or you throw it down this way and it goes to the bottom, it comes right back up. So when we think about this idea of the turn, the world's getting further and further away from God's order and intent for the world, and then that yo-yo gets to the bottom. Jesus is resurrected, and then everything turns around. It flips upside down. Things are starting on a different trajectory. And that's the story that we're telling this Easter season, is this turn where the world is getting better and the world is becoming what God intended for it because of Jesus. Now, part of that we have said ongoing is that the world will not be fully remade until Jesus returns. But in the meantime, there is these moments of hope. And I like to say that we can live from the future today. So let's explore what it looks like for Jesus, his resurrection to be the turn, and for this idea of living from the future today and how the turn impacts our world. So you take out your pew Bible, or it will be on the screen. Or if you have your own Bible, or if you like to use the Bible app, if you're using your phone, I'll think, oh, you're just looking at the phone, the Bible on your phone. I won't say anything. Doesn't mean somebody else might not, but I won't. If you want to follow in the pew Bible, Luke 24 verses 13 through 35 starts on page 1507. 1507 of Luke, chapter 24, 13 through 35. So let's take a look at this passage. Now we have heard this story here for the children's sermon. So now let's take a look at it in Luke and take a little bit deeper dive into the story. So this is how the story starts. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. Now, number one rule when we read the Bible, if you were to take out your Bible and open up to this passage and read this, now that same day two of them were going to the village called Emmaus, you should automatically say, okay, well, wait a minute. What just happened that this is continuing? Because when we read the Bible, we have to understand how one passage connects to the previous. So if we were to look at Luke, and in general, think about the Gospel of Luke, there's some things about it that are going to help us understand this passage. Now, for the last 2 weeks, we had been looking at John. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, there's 4, right? And when we read John, we're reading John. And now we're reading Luke. So with what's in John, we have to sort of take all of that and put it aside and be like, well, wait a minute, because Luke is now telling the story. And this is the way I like to think of it. If one of us were to come up here and I had a table with a bunch of puzzle pieces on it, and I said, okay, I want you to grab 5 puzzle pieces. So one of you comes up and grabs 5. Now, that is the whole puzzle. You have 5 pieces of the puzzle. And maybe you're able to arrange them in how you think the picture would look. Now, then the next person comes up and you grab 5 different pieces and you arrange it. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, there are all these stories of Jesus that the Gospel authors had. That they knew, like for some of them, like if they were with Jesus, they knew the stories. Some of them probably heard the stories from the early Christians. Some of them would have talked to, like Luke says, that he talked to eyewitnesses. So he's going around gathering these stories. He has all these puzzle pieces. Now Luke's telling his gospel story, and so he's taking some of those pieces and telling the story. It's just like any of us, like we can't maybe tell your spouse or a family member your whole day. You have to decide what parts of the day you're going to tell them. It's the same with the stories of Jesus. So when Luke told the story of Jesus, he included some pieces that none of the other gospel authors included. And one of them is this story we looked at today. And then the other one is in the first couple chapters of Jesus' life. So if you were to go back to Luke chapter 1, there is several pieces of information in Luke chapter 1 and early chapter 2 that we have nowhere else. But specifically in Luke chapter 1, there are 2 songs about Jesus. A song from Mary, Jesus' mother, and a song from Zechariah, who is John the Baptist's father. And then you go on into chapter 2, and we have that birth story that we've all heard that is only in Luke that we always tell at Christmas whenever they are traveling to the inn, and then there's the birth in the stable. And then after that, there's a couple other stories where Jesus is older, and he's going to the temple, and a couple of different people who have been waiting for the Messiah, one named Simeon, and the other one, I don't want to say her name and get it wrong. She's a prophetess, and she gets to see Jesus. I don't know if I can grab it quickly. I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Yeah, I'm not saying her name, but she's in here. Anna, the daughter of Penuel. So these 2 people come and they make statements about Jesus. And what this all amounts to is this story that Luke is telling where Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures and the one who comes to save Israel. So that's at the very beginning of the story. Now Luke tells his story like normal, and then he gets to the end, and he adds this story about this road to Emmaus. Now on this road, there's these 2 disciples, and we learn later they're not the 12 disciples we know of. There are other people who were close to Jesus who weren't the 12. He had others. At one time, he sends up to 72 people to go and tell the message. Now these 2 are on their way to this village 7 miles away, it says. They're walking, which would have been a normal walk for them. They would have done that all the time. They're walking, and they're talking about what had just happened, what they had just seen in Jerusalem. Now it says the same day, so that is referring to how the women had just found the tomb empty, and then Peter, it says in Luke, Peter had gone and saw the tomb empty. There's no indication in Luke, though, that anybody yet had seen Jesus before these people left. So they don't hear any of those stories. All they know is that they found the tomb empty, and they're confused. And this is what happens. So verse 14, they're talking with each other. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. So now Jesus comes up, and he's walking with them. But we're told that they didn't recognize him, which we don't have time to go into all of that. I'd be happy to talk about it. But for Luke, it's just what happens. And it also happened in a couple other places where we even heard in the Gospel of John, Mary didn't recognize Jesus at first, but then she did. So these disciples don't recognize Jesus, but they would have known he looked like a fellow Jew. When you're walking, it was common to talk. Walking in numbers was safer. So they would not have been surprised that this traveler is going to walk with them. So Jesus is walking, and this is what happens. He asks them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" So Jesus hears that they're talking. He maybe gets a couple of, maybe he hears a couple things he's curious about. Also, he would have known what they're talking about. But he wants for them to tell him. So he says, "What is it that you are talking about?" And this is their response. Continuing in verse 17. They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" What things? He asked. So Jesus at this point is not indicating that he has any idea what happened, which in a city like Jerusalem, with what happened, most likely anyone in the city would have heard. specifically about Jesus' death and crucifixion, maybe the word had not spread about his empty tomb, but certainly about his death. But Jesus says, I don't know what's happened. And so this is what they tell him. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied, he was a prophet, powerful in the word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Now remember, Luke tells us at the beginning of the story that Jesus is the one who's going to redeem or rescue or save Israel. So now Luke is showing how the disciples did not understand what was going to happen with Jesus. His death, they thought, meant it was the end of the story. But look also at how they describe Jesus. They say he was a prophet, powerful in word and deeds. So he was a prophet and he had powerful words and deeds. But there's nothing about him being the Son of God, nothing about him being the Messiah. So these disciples at this moment are uncertain of what to think about Jesus. They know they cared for him deeply. They knew that they thought he was the one who was going to rescue Israel. But he had died. And that's why they're so brokenhearted and confused. Also, they don't know what to think about what they just heard from the other disciples about the empty tomb. Because that's what they say right here. And they continue. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition to some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. So these two disciples, they have all of those pieces. That happened on that first morning, and as we heard yesterday, before Jesus appeared in the tomb, or into the room, like we heard in the story from the children's sermon. Before all that happened, the disciples had all that same information. And remember, they stayed locked in the room. So these disciples are also uncertain. They don't have any sort of framework to know how to think about what happened with Jesus. So this is now Jesus' response. He said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? So now Jesus steps in, and he starts to explain. In verse 27, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So this is when things start to get interesting. Jesus, what he does after he hears these two disciples is he takes them through all of the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, their Bible, and he shows them where it always said all along that the Messiah had to suffer before he could receive his glory. Now, no Jewish people at that time thought the Messiah needed to suffer. They didn't have that in their framework. They thought the Messiah would come and lead them in a military victory over Rome. But instead, Jesus came. He didn't try to lead them in a military victory. He didn't even try. Instead, he spoke and he did amazing things. And then his words threatened their own leaders so much that they arrested him and had him executed by Rome, the very people he was supposed to free them from. And so all of Jesus' disciples, all the Jewish people who had followed Jesus, and even the religious leaders said, well, this isn't what the Messiah is supposed to be, so he couldn't have been the Messiah. And now what Jesus does is he says, wait a minute. You got it wrong. You hadn't seen in the scriptures that all along I was supposed to suffer before I would receive glory. So this is what we need to understand as we look at this story and think about how it impacts our life. The turn, that moment when the yo-yo comes up, that moment when you make that turn from your 1.5 mile run and you're heading back, that moment always had to include the Messiah suffering. It always had to include the Messiah suffering. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. That was always central to the story, all the way through Scripture. In Isaiah, there's these songs called the Songs of the Suffering Servant. And when you read those, it talks about the one who was wounded so that God's people could be restored. And what that story ends up being is it's not just God's anointed one, but God himself takes on human flesh, lives the life that none of us could live, and then offers himself as the suffering servant for his people. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. So like I said, Luke was heavy on emphasizing how Jesus was always supposed to be the one that completed the story of Israel. From the beginning of his life, he had these prophecies and these songs spoken and sung about him that said he would come to redeem his people, rescue the world, reverse the brokenness, welcome back the peace and the shalom that we all wait for. And it had to start with his suffering. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. For us, this is important because it shows us who God is. A God who cares about us so deeply. He enters the world to offer himself for us. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. Now remember, at this point, these disciples don't know who he is. They think he's some guy. So this is how the story ends. Verse 28. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. So he was going to continue on, but these two disciples say, No, come with us. Stay the night. It's almost dark, and you can go on in the morning. They don't know who he is. But I think at this point, they're like, there's something about this guy. We want to hear more. So this is what then happens. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while we talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" If you have ever heard the story of John Wesley, he talks about how he was in a service. He'd already been an Anglican priest at this point. He'd already been to America and tried to start like a church in the colonies and been sent back to Europe. And he's in this church. And he's hearing Martin Luther's gospel or a commentary on the book of Romans. And as John Wesley hears Martin Luther talk about the grace and faith of Jesus, he talked about his heart was gently warmed. And he credits that moment as the moment where he was saved. Even though he'd already been a priest and he'd already, like I said, tried to become a missionary pastor across the Atlantic here to the States, the heart gently warmed. And so for these disciples, they said, even before we knew who Jesus was, something about him moved in us. And it's when he was teaching them that the world turned with Jesus' suffering. So what is it that the disciples did? They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord is risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So Luke's first resurrection appearance is these two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And that resurrection appearance is coupled with Jesus teaching to his disciples that he had to suffer before he could be raised to glory. And for Luke, it's all about the scriptures of the Hebrew people, the Old Testament scriptures, the scriptures that for most of us, for most of our lives, they might have been a story that we had during Sunday school, but a lot of it was hard to read. And that's how I felt for most of my life. But now I think the Old Testament scriptures are more exciting even than the New Testament. When you read the story, it's so powerfully tight and pointing to this figure who would be Jesus, who would come to save his people. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. So after his death, Jesus' disciples believed it was over. No one expected his suffering to be central to his work of saving his people. But as we heard from Jesus, suffering had to come before his glory. That was central to the story. So what this means for Easter is that the world turned with Jesus' suffering. The cross wasn't something that God had to deal with. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something that was thought of after the fact. It was always central to the story. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. So what does this mean for us? That's the question. Well, the first answer is that the Hebrew scriptures are central to our faith. And when you look at our Bible, you even see, so that's the New Testament versus the Old Testament. And actually part of this is the end notes. So that's not all passages. The Old Testament is central to the story. It's one reason why we always have an Old Testament reading every week. Doesn't matter what I'm preaching. It doesn't matter if we only have one other passage. And also it's why we include the Psalm. The Psalm is the songbook of God's people. But in there are these themes that we see come alive in the life of Jesus. It's part of our story. We should know it just as well as Jesus' fellow Jews did when he was alive. The world turned with Jesus' suffering. And the reason that we can say this is because of the Hebrew scriptures. And the second thing that we need to remember is that we serve a God who chose to show his greatness through suffering. So when you think about the world, you think about the political powers in our world. How is it that they show their might and their power? Is it through sacrifice or is it through power? Think about the greatest civilians that have ever existed. And we could name them, we could go back through. In Jesus' day, it would have been the Roman Empire. Before that, Alexander the Great and the Greeks. We can think about the own powers that came up through history, the Roman, or the British Empire, that we are indebted to for us being here. These powers, these human created entities, they don't use suffering to show their power. They don't. But the God that we serve, the King that we follow, said, "For me to show my glory, I must suffer." And that's when the world turned. That's when things changed. The world turned with Jesus' suffering.